Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Leanna. Today we are going to be tackling the subject about why racism towards white people just does not exist, nor does reverse racism. This is something I've also heard it called. It's not a thing. And please know that whenever I'm talking about racism, issues about race, I'm always trying to come to it from a position of a white person who's still learning every single day and talking to other white people who are hopefully in a position to hear and listen. I'm not an educator in any way, shape, or form, but I know that I am in a position to hopefully come onto a platform and have people listen, and that's always where I'm coming from. If I ever misstep, I'm very teachable. I'm open to that fact. Please let me know. And this is not a video addressing people of color at all, because I just can't do that. So, as someone who has and who tries to have conversations about racism with other white people, I find that the biggest obstacle I come across is white people thinking that we can experience racism ourselves. It's almost like coming up against a giant roadblock. Stop here, go no further. It really is. Because once we feel like we are the oppressed, conversation just gets shut down. As soon as we feel that we are also being oppressed, it's almost like that's when the centering happens. That's when the over here, me too, I'm also a victim happens. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, it's something that addresses the issue of systemic anti-Black racism that is pervasive in our society. The All Lives Matter movement didn't exist until Black Lives Matter existed. That is a direct response to Black Lives Matter to say all lives matter. All lives matter is basically saying, but what about me? Yeah, sure, your life matters. What about mine? What about ours? Okay? Our lives as white people already matter. In fact, they matter too fucking much. Black Lives Matter has never been about Black lives being the only lives that matter. Black Lives Matter already means all lives matter. It means that all lives need to matter, and right now they don't. And so we are focused on the fact that all lives don't matter and they need to matter, and that Black lives right now do not matter equally to the rest. And if you don't get that, when you scream all lives matter, you're taking focus away from that, and you are saying, what about me? Because of this, I thought I would take the time to address the all too popular belief that racism is real towards white people. And it is a horribly popular belief. In fact, I wrote recently in one of my Patreon posts that from a 2018 poll of 15 to 24-year-olds in the US found that 43% of white American men and 29% of white American women agreed that racism against white people was a huge problem, as serious as discrimination against all other races. So that should tell you right there that this is a huge problem. And I wrote also, I'm writing a series of posts about racism in Canada. This is also a problem here. And it's one that we are very good at denying, very good at turning our backs to, because people with white skin privilege are very good at turning our heads away from things that don't affect us personally. Just like with any marginalized group, say if you're an abled individual, ableism doesn't affect you, so you're very good at turning away from disability issues. Any marginalization that does not affect you can become very easy to look away from, right? That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean it's not an issue. And this is just my own personal anecdote and my own personal observation. What I've personally noticed is that white people who believe that discrimination towards whites based on race, they tend to believe this based on a very basic dictionary definition. That's what they throw out there. Is like, well, this is what I read in a dictionary. Discrimination on a person based on skin color, based on race. That's a huge problem. To rely on a dictionary definition in this day and age for something horribly complex, don't you think that that in itself is a problem? What if you were trying to explain to someone what cancer was like? This is something that, say, you or someone you know had personally experienced, and you were trying to tell them how horrible it was. And then the person you're telling comes back to you and says, well, I read this in the dictionary. This is what the dictionary told me it was like. So you're wrong. So you're basically just denying the lived experiences of the person who's actually been through it. That's what denying racism is. And you might think that's an unfair comparison to compare racism to cancer. It's not, though. Racism is a cancer. It's killing people every single day. Referring to the dictionary for someone's lived experiences is nothing less than abusive gaslighting. To understand why racism against white people isn't a thing, it's important to understand what racism actually is and how it functions. Racism can be individual. This is something that occurs on an individual level, person to person. This is the biases that you have and we have, and how we take that out in our interactions with another person. So microaggressions, tone policing, gaslighting, and of course the use of racial slurs. But racism, more importantly, is also systemic and it's institutional. This means that racism has permeated every corner of society. It is in every institution of society, such as education, healthcare, political platforms and voting, employment, and so on. It's everywhere. But let's go back to individual racism for a moment, because this is where a lot of people tend to get hung up and stuck on the fact that, okay, well, if racism is individual, then that means that anyone can be racist to anyone else, which isn't really true, because then you're missing another key component, which is that racism also is privilege and power. Having hurt feelings for being labeled a piece of food is not the same thing as being called a word that has historically been used to demonize, dehumanize, and oppress an entire group of people. And it's always been us, white people, who are in the position of oppressor. It's always been us, white people, who have been in the position to create systems and institutions to oppress Black, Indigenous, and people of color. When it boils down to it, the oppressor really cannot be oppressed. There have never been systems or institutions put into place in society that oppress white people solely on the purpose of race. Yes, there are systems in place that can oppress white people on other things, such as disability, ableism. There are systems put in place to oppress people based on gender and sexuality, but these are not based in racial identity. These are things that cross over regardless of race. So a person who is white and disabled or trans or queer is not going to have the same experiences as someone who is Black and disabled or trans or queer, etc. These things cross racial lines. They're not exclusive to the identity of being white. So yes, white people can be oppressed for certain parts of their identity. Whiteness is not it. And racism is not something that happened overnight, not at all. It's something that's been happening for centuries. White people are the ones who created the construct of race. Race is a social construct, and along with it, we also created racism. This concept aligns greatly with European imperialism and colonialism, for racism was really kind of concocted as a way to justify the brutalities of slavery, colonization, and eugenics. And all three of these brutalities are still taking place in society today, just in different ways. Slavery has taken form through the mass incarceration system, which disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, and people of color. One of the ways colonization takes form throughout our world is through a dominant group of people or a country stealing goods and resources from a less dominant group or country, the perpetrators of whom are predominantly North America and Europe. Eugenics, a system that never really went away, has seen a huge resurgence since the start of COVID-19. ICU units are prioritizing people who are white, wealthy, and healthy over those who are most marginalized. In this way, systemic and institutional racism is also very much a generational thing. The laws which our racial ancestors put into place and which affected Black, Indigenous, people of color in their time now get passed down so that we reap those benefits, and they disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, people of color of our time. So if you don't believe me, let's have a look at some examples. Citizenship and exclusion laws in the 1800s made it impossible for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to have the same jobs as white people, or to even be allowed to save money. Meanwhile, white people in the 1800s had already accrued a large amount of wealth off of Black, Indigenous, and immigrant workers. And even the poorest of white people, such as Irish and Italian immigrants, who at the time were not viewed as white, were allowed to subjugate workers based on a racial hierarchy. Irish and Italian workers were actually some of the first militia allowed to capture enslaved individuals, kind of like the first police force. So the next time you say, oh, the Irish were slaves, the Italian were slaves, no, they were servants and they were allowed far superior rights. Anyways, this started a racial wealth gap, something which still has not closed to this day in many countries around the world, including the US and Canada. White people are not only earning vastly more money, but they're being born into far more generational wealth, as opposed to families of color who had to start from scratch much later in life. To break this down a little bit further, it's estimated that here in Canada, women of color earn 59 cents for every dollar earned by white men. Men of color earn 79 cents for every dollar earned by white men. And this is despite the fact that people of color overall have a much higher participation in the employment field. In the US, women of color earn as little as 54 cents per dollar earned by white men. Asian women earn as much as 90 cents, but these figures are often skewed, not taking into consideration the different backgrounds of Asians, such as South Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian. Men of color make as little as 87 cents per dollar earned by white men, with, again, Asians earning more, but the figures are not quite representative of the whole. Compounding this wage gap is the fact that banking institutions and employment hiring practices are very racially biased. Banks notoriously discriminate when it comes to their mortgage and lending practices and are approximately 2.7 times more likely to turn away people who are Black and Indigenous, or give much higher interest rates. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are up to 108% more likely to have a high interest, high cost loan. When businesses are looking for employees, even in what is considered a low discrimination country, whatever that is, I honestly don't know what that looks like anymore. Employers are still 25% more likely to hire a white person. Employers are also far more likely to give a job interview or a callback to somebody with a white-sounding name, such as John Smith, with Black, Indigenous, and people of color having to set out roughly 70 to 95% more job applications. And companies are also less likely to give executive seats to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, with Black people holding only 3.2% of senior leadership positions in all of the US. Education laws also have something to do with this. Initially, post-slavery, Black students were not allowed to go to school at all. Here in Canada, our Indigenous people were also segregated. When they were not allowed to go to the same schools as white people, and their schools were comparably underfunded. Schools were eventually integrated, but the high school and college graduate rate for families of color was significantly lower due to being held back for so long. The graduate rate has increased over the years, but it's still comparably lower overall, with 42% Black college graduation rate in the US and 30% in Canada. Again, this is how racism becomes a generational thing. Post-slavery, Black, Indigenous, and people of color were not allowed to own their own property due to citizenship laws. When they finally could, a system known as redlining was put into place, which barred them from owning certain property. This is still a system that is in place today. Redlining forces communities of color into the poorest neighborhoods and subsequently lowers the property value. Schools in the US get their funding based off of property tax, meaning the education people get is not universal. Once they started seeing that these neighborhoods were filled with predominantly lower income people of color, companies started building their repositories nearby, polluting the air and leading to more health complications. Redline neighborhoods are actually several degrees hotter than non-redlined neighborhoods. But while pollution rose in these areas, the amount of grocery stores lowered, leading to poorer diets for those who, for various reasons, couldn't travel farther to get their goods. This is known as environmental racism. Healthcare used to be entirely segregated, so you guessed it, there were white-only hospitals, where the care was top-notch, and Black people and Indigenous people had to build their own hospitals, where supplies were often low and funds were low. It was normal for Indigenous populations across North America to receive segregated healthcare and very poor healthcare. Here in Canada, Indigenous populations were forced into the basements of hospitals, where white people were afraid they had something called native tuberculosis. While clinics have become desegregated today, medical racism is still a pervasive issue in our society. For example, doctors still believe that Black people feel less pain and that their skin is thicker, and they are less likely to prescribe pain medication to a Black person even when it is medically necessary. Indigenous people are more likely to be accused of intoxication where there is none present, and there is an epidemic of both parties being ignored to death. Voting was done entirely by white men for a very long time. Slowly, men of other races were allowed to vote, and then women, and it wasn't up until roughly the 70s or 80s that everyone had the right to vote in North America. But then came voter suppression. Laws which made it harder for marginalized communities to vote based on who had citizenship, who had proper identification, and who had been to jail or prison. Who did these laws target? Of course, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Mass incarceration is an enormous system that started decades ago, starting with the war on drugs in the Reagan administration. This was a fake war to target Black communities who were no more likely, in fact, far less likely, to sell or possess drugs. The rates of incarceration only went up from there as mandatory minimums were put in place, as well as stop and frisk or stop and search laws. These are laws which would give police the right to stop anyone they deemed looked suspicious without any evidence or warrant. This meant that more and more Black, Indigenous, and people of color were being stopped on the streets for no reason other than a racist cop, and charged and put in jail at increasingly higher rates than white people. It's estimated that 1 in 3 Black men will face an arrest charge at some point in their life in the US, with Black people overall 6 times more likely to be imprisoned than white people after having committed the same crime or no crime. afterwards having their rights stripped of them upon release, because once you go to jail, gaining employment becomes even that much harder. You have to check the box that says you are a felon. Renting or owning property becomes that much harder than before because you have to check the box which says you are a felon. And voting becomes out of the question, and chances are that there was a low or no offense. It's even possible to have these rights taken away without ever having gone to jail, only being put on probation or parole, meaning there are millions of people, millions, predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US unable to vote. This is honestly just a simplified version of some of the systemic racism that has been passed down generationally. Now keep in mind, for each of these, it was white people who enforced these systems, okay? It was us. And it's also white people, us, who continue to do so. We have not historically nor presently experienced race-based discrimination in property, employment, banking, environment, healthcare, voting, policing, or justice systems. And if you think I'm wrong, I'd encourage you to start this video from the top. I'm sure that I am missing a lot here. I'm going to be linking a few books down below which have helped me a lot in my education personally, and some articles as well if you're unable to get the books for whatever reason. I know that some people either don't have the money, and libraries right now are also kind of at capacity in terms of loans. So I will leave those down below if you'd like to continue your reading. I'll have details for where else you can find me around the internet, and there's a subscribe button down below if you would like to follow me here. Please feel free to do so, and if you don't want to, that's okay. I hope you learned something here, and if not, you know, I tried. Thank you so much for being here. As always, Black Lives Matter. All lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter. See you soon. Bye.